Close your eyes, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow. Tonight, we are going somewhere that has been erased. A civilization so vast, so technically advanced, so deeply woven into the landscape of the world, that the very effort to remove it from memory required centuries of deliberate work. You will not find it in your history textbooks. You will not hear its name spoken in university lecture halls. But if you know how to look, you can see its fingerprints everywhere. In the buildings that no official history can explain. In the maps that show cities where cities should not be. In the photographs that predate the stories we were told about the world. Tonight, we travel to Tartaria, and we discover 7 things this civilization built that we still cannot rebuild today. There is no rush. The night is long and soft. You are warm and safe and still. Each word is simply a quiet companion as you drift. Let the story carry you down, slowly, like a river moving through an old and sleeping land. We begin at the beginning, or rather, at what some researchers believe was the ending. Sometime in the 1800s, the official narrative of history tells us, the world was relatively simple. Cities were growing, steam power was new, electricity was barely understood. And yet, scattered across North America, across Europe, across Asia, researchers in the alternative history community point to buildings of extraordinary sophistication. Buildings with heating systems embedded in their floors. Buildings with massive domes that amplify natural resonance. Buildings whose granite facades were cut with a precision that modern laser tools can barely match. Buildings with electrical infrastructure hidden inside their walls, decades before electricity was supposedly invented. These researchers ask a single quiet question: how? How were these buildings made with the tools that supposedly existed? How were they funded by cities that had supposedly only recently been settled? How were they designed by architects whose names appear in no educational records? Who left no apprenticeships, no schools, no paper trails? And a second question, quieter still: who lived in them before us? The answer some researchers give is Tartaria. Tartaria was not a small kingdom tucked into a corner of the medieval world. On maps from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Tartaria appears as one of the largest political entities on Earth. Great Tartaria, as it was sometimes labelled, covered much of Asia. Tartaria Magna, Tartaria Chinensis, Muscovite Tartaria, Independent Tartaria. These were not small notations. These were vast, labelled territories on maps produced by respected European cartographers, maps that hung in the halls of kings, that guided the ships of explorers, that shaped the understanding of the world for educated people of that era. And then, gradually, beginning in the late 1700s and accelerating through the 1800s, those labels disappeared. The territory remained. The maps changed. Alternative history researchers call this the Great Erasure, a deliberate scrubbing of a civilization from the record, and they point to a specific catastrophic event they believe caused it, an event they call the mud flood. The mud flood theory holds that at some point in the recent past, a catastrophic event buried the lower stories of buildings across the northern hemisphere. You can see the evidence, these researchers say, in the sunken first floors of old buildings in European cities, in basement windows that look like ground floor windows, in doors that open below street level, in cities that appear in photographs from the 1800s, already ancient, already built, already finished, with populations that supposedly only arrived decades earlier. Something happened. Something reset the world. And from that reset, a new civilization arose. Our civilization. The one that was handed a ready-made world of extraordinary buildings and told to fill them with a new story. That is the framework. Settle into it gently. You do not need to believe it tonight. You only need to let it drift around you, soft and strange and old, like smoke from a fire that burned 1,000 years ago. Because tonight, we are not here to debate. We are here to explore. 7 things, 7 technologies, 7 mysteries that sleep inside the stones of old buildings and old maps and old photographs, waiting quietly for someone to ask the right question. Let your body grow heavy. Let the world outside grow quiet. The story is just beginning. The first thing Tartaria built that we still cannot rebuild is the ether antenna. You have seen these structures. You have walked past them in cities across the world and been told a name for them. Steeples, spires, towers, clock towers, bell towers, the ornate pointed tops of old cathedrals and civic buildings, the elegant copper finials on 19th century train stations, the strange metal rods that crown the rooftops of old city halls from San Francisco to St. Petersburg. Official history calls them decorative, architectural flourishes, the taste of an era that liked things ornate. Alternative researchers call them something else. They call them energy receivers. The theory begins with Nikola Tesla, a name that is real, a figure documented in history, whose work on wireless energy transmission is well established. Tesla believed and demonstrated in laboratory conditions that the Earth itself is a conductor, that the atmosphere between the ground and the ionosphere carries electrical charge, that it might be possible to tap into this charge and transmit energy wirelessly across vast distances. His Wardenclyffe Tower project, funded and then abandoned, was his attempt to build a practical system for doing exactly this. What alternative researchers ask is this: what if Tesla did not invent this idea? What if he rediscovered it? What if the spires and finials and metal-tipped towers on buildings across the world were not decorative additions but functional ones? What if they were, in fact, the receiving end of a wireless energy grid built by a civilization that understood something about Earth energy and atmospheric electricity that we are only beginning to approach? They point to the specific materials used in these finials: copper, brass, gold leaf. All excellent conductors. They point to the shapes, often precisely tapered, a geometry that resembles modern antenna design. They point to the fact that many old buildings had these metal elements connected, through the structure of the building itself, down through copper pipes and metal frameworks, into the earth beneath. Grounding cables, the official explanation says. Lightning protection. Perhaps, the alternative researchers say, but perhaps lightning protection was a secondary function, a convenient cover for something else. A distribution system, a way to bring free energy, drawn from the sky and the earth, into a building without burning any fuel. They point to the heating systems found in old buildings, floors in Roman and pre-Roman structures with channels beneath them for warm air, old European manor houses with warmth that seemed to come from nowhere, from the walls themselves, buildings in cold climates that required almost no visible fuel source to remain comfortable through winter. If these buildings had access to a free, wireless energy supply drawn from the earth and the atmosphere through the metal structures on their rooftops, the heating systems make sense. The scale of the buildings makes sense. The cost of construction makes sense. Without that energy supply, researchers argue, none of it makes sense. Can we rebuild an ether antenna today? We can build antennas. We can build towers. We can even demonstrate in laboratory settings that the Earth carries electrical potential and that this potential can, under certain conditions, be drawn upon. But we have no working model of the kind of grid-scale, wireless energy distribution that these structures supposedly represent. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was never completed. No modern project has replaced it. The technology, if it existed, in the form these researchers describe, is gone. What remains are the spires, the finials, the copper rods pointing toward the sky from the tops of old buildings in 100 cities. You are drifting now. The sound of my voice is growing softer. Let the image of those spires rise gently in your mind. Slender copper fingers, reaching toward the clouds, drawing something down from the sky, something warm and quiet and free, and let that image carry you a little deeper into sleep. The building beneath you hums, very softly. The walls hold a warmth that needs no explanation tonight. Rest. The second thing is waiting for us when you are ready. The second thing Tartaria built that we still cannot rebuild is the acoustic architecture. Sound is more powerful than we give it credit for. We think of sound as something we hear, waves of pressure in the air that reach our ears and register as music or speech or noise. But sound is also physical. Sound can move objects. Sound can shatter glass at the right frequency. Sound can heal tissue. Sound can kill. These are not theories. These are documented phenomena in modern physics and medicine. Ultrasonic surgery is real. Acoustic levitation, the lifting of small objects using precisely arranged sound waves, has been demonstrated in laboratories around the world. The mystery is this: these effects require precise frequencies. They require understanding of resonance, of harmonic relationships, of the specific way that sound waves interact with physical matter. This is sophisticated knowledge. And yet, scattered around the world, there are ancient structures that appear to have been designed with exactly this knowledge embedded in their dimensions. The King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid of Giza produces a very specific resonant frequency when struck. The chamber's dimensions are not arbitrary. Researchers have measured the acoustic properties of the chamber and found that it amplifies frequencies in the range associated with deep states of meditation, and possibly with other effects that are harder to categorize. The sarcophagus in the chamber, when struck, rings like a bell. The entire chamber acts like a tuning fork, a resonant box designed with acoustic precision. How? By whom? With what knowledge? This is not unique to Egypt. The ancient temples of Malta, among the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth, have chambers that produce the same phenomenon. Researchers measured the resonant frequency of the main chamber at Hal Saflieni Hypogam and found that it sits at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that neurological research has associated with specific altered states of consciousness. This was not an accident of construction. The chamber was carved from solid rock. Its dimensions were deliberate. Someone understood what 110 Hz would do to a human nervous system and built a room that produced it. Alternative Tartaria researchers point to this evidence and extend it. They argue that the old civic buildings of the 19th century, the ones with the massive domes and the high ceilings, and the stone floors and the curved walls, were also acoustically designed. Not for music, though they often sound extraordinary. For something more functional, for amplifying the human voice across distances without electrical amplification. For creating spaces in which certain kinds of thinking, certain kinds of decision-making, certain altered but productive states of awareness were naturally enhanced by the acoustic environment. They go further. Some researchers argue that the combination of acoustic architecture and the ether energy systems in old buildings work together, that a building properly energized through its antenna structures would also function as an acoustic resonance chamber, and that the combination of electromagnetic and acoustic frequencies created environments that affected human consciousness and physiology in ways we no longer understand. We cannot rebuild this. We can build buildings that sound good. We can design concert halls with careful acoustic modeling. But the specific knowledge of how to cut stone, to produce frequencies that alter neurological states, how to proportion rooms so they resonate in specific therapeutic ranges, how to integrate acoustic and electromagnetic effects into a single architectural system. That knowledge, if it ever existed, in the systematic form these researchers describe, is gone. What remains are the old buildings, the domes, the curved stone walls that carry a whisper from one end of a room to the other. the chambers underground that ring like bells in frequencies too low to hear but deep enough to feel in the chest. Your breathing has slowed. Your body is heavy now, pleasantly heavy, settled into the surface beneath you. The room around you is quiet. Let that quietness deepen. Let it become its own kind of frequency, below hearing, below thought, in the space where sleep lives. Something hums, very gently. You are safe. You are still. The story continues. The third thing Tartaria built that we still cannot rebuild is the star fort network. From the ground, they look like ordinary fortifications. Thick stone walls, earthen ramparts, wide defensive ditches. Some of them are well known. Tourists visit them, historians write about them, and the accepted narrative describes them as defensive military structures built between the 15th and 19th centuries by European military engineers. From the air, they look like something else entirely. Star forts, seen from above, are geometric mandalas, perfect multi-pointed stars, often with 8 or 10 or 12 points, each point precisely angled, each rampart exactly proportioned. The whole design displaying a mathematical precision that is extraordinary even by modern engineering standards. The aerial photographs of these structures reveal designs so regular, so complex, so geometrically perfect, that military architecture alone seems an insufficient explanation. Alternative researchers point to their distribution. Star forts are found everywhere. In the Americas, built supposedly by early European colonists who had no earth-moving machinery and few engineering resources. In Asia, in Africa, in Russia, where dozens of them dot the landscape of Siberia, supposedly built by a Russian empire that was simultaneously insisting on its official maps that Siberia was largely empty and uncivilized, in remote locations where there was no obvious military threat to defend against. They are everywhere, in climates where the earthworks should have eroded centuries ago, in locations that make no strategic sense, in scales that seem impossible for the populations supposedly responsible for them, and they all share the same geometric vocabulary, the same precise angles, the same mathematical relationships between their parts, as if they were designed by a single engineering tradition that understood something specific about geometry and its relationship to the land, and perhaps to the Earth's own energy fields. Some alternative researchers have mapped the distribution of star forts and noted that they appear at regular intervals across large regions, suggesting a network rather than individual defensive installations. A network built on precise geodetic intervals following the energy lines of the Earth, positioned at nodes in a planetary grid that relates to magnetic fields, to telluric currents, to the movement of energy through the Earth itself. The Tartaria theory holds that these structures were not primarily military, that the military interpretation was applied to them after the fact, after the civilization that built them was gone, because the new civilization needed a reason for their existence that fit within the new story of history. What were they actually for? The theories vary. Energy amplification, using the geometric form of the star to concentrate and direct Earth energies. Navigation, using the precision of the geometry as markers in a planetary coordinate system. Communication, using the resonant properties of earthwork geometries in ways not yet understood. Community, as central organizing structures for large populations who understood their significance. We cannot rebuild them. We can build earthworks. We have excavators and laser leveling and GPS positioning. But the knowledge of why to build a star fort, what its geometry was actually serving, what it was connected to and how, that knowledge is gone. The structures remain, hundreds of them, thousands of them, scattered across the world in their perfect impossible stars, saying nothing and everything at once. Let the image settle in your mind. A perfect star of green earthworks seen from far above. The precise angles of its points, the deep shadows of its ditches. The way the shape seems to mean something you almost recognize but cannot quite name. The night is deep now. Your mind is growing soft at the edges. Let the star fort float in that softness. Let it turn, slowly, like a slow green star, and let the turning carry you down, further down. Good. The fourth thing Tartaria built that we still cannot rebuild is the megalithic stonework. We need to begin with an honest statement about what modern engineering can and cannot do. Modern engineering is extraordinary. We can build skyscrapers a kilometer tall. We can construct bridges that span kilometers of open water. We can bore tunnels through mountains. We can manufacture components with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. And yet, with all of this machinery, all of this precision, all of this engineering knowledge, we cannot do what the builders of certain ancient structures apparently did. We cannot cut granite to fitting tolerances of 0.002 millimeters with hand tools. We cannot move 100-ton stones across mountainous terrain and place them in walls with such precision that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. We cannot quarry monolithic blocks of stone from solid bedrock, with no tool marks, no drill holes, no evidence of wedging or splitting, the stone simply removed as if dissolved. These are not exaggerations. These are the documented observations of engineers who have actually gone to these sites and tried to understand them. At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, the walls are built of stones weighing between 100 and 360 tons, fitted together in complex polygonal shapes, each face angled to meet its neighbors in a three-dimensional jigsaw that required not just lifting the stones but positioning them with extraordinary precision. The shapes are not simple rectangles. They are irregular polygons with many faces, each face a different angle, each stone shaped to match every stone that touches it. The tolerances of the fitting are, in places, tighter than the tolerances of modern machined components. Archaeologists attribute this construction to the Inca civilization, using stone hammers, bronze chisels, and human labor. Some researchers have demonstrated that primitive tools can, over sufficient time and with sufficient effort, produce individual worked stone surfaces. But the fitting of these surfaces together, at this precision, at this scale, with stones of this weight, has never been convincingly demonstrated with primitive tools in any experiment. Similar stonework appears at sites around the world. Pumapunku in Bolivia, where H-shaped stone blocks with channels and drill holes of extraordinary precision are found scattered across the landscape. The Valley Temple at Giza, where granite and limestone blocks weighing hundreds of tons are fitted together with the same impossible precision. The megalithic walls of Cusco, where the oldest stonework, in the most protected locations, is clearly different from the Inca construction built on top of it. Different in precision, different in scale, different in the tool marks left, or rather, not left. Alternative Tartaria researchers place this stonework within the Tartarian timeline. They argue that the megalithic construction visible at these sites predates the civilizations credited with building them. That the Inca, the Egyptians, the various ancient cultures found at these sites were not the builders, but the inheritors. That they built their own, cruder structures on top of or against the foundations left by an earlier, more sophisticated civilization. The technology used to cut and place this stonework is genuinely unknown. Some researchers have proposed sonic cutting, using sound waves at the resonant frequency of the stone, to cut it without contact. Others have proposed some form of chemical softening, pointing to legends from multiple cultures of a plant substance that softens stone temporarily, allowing it to be molded like clay. Others have proposed electromagnetic tools, using focused energy in ways we do not yet understand. None of these hypotheses has been proven, and none of the conventional explanations has been convincingly demonstrated. The stones are there. The precision is measurable. The explanation is missing. We cannot rebuild it. Give a modern construction crew unlimited time, unlimited budget, unlimited machinery, and tell them to build a wall of 360-ton irregular granite polygons with fitting tolerances of 0.002 millimeters, and they will tell you it cannot be done with any technology currently available. And yet, the walls stand, the stones fit, and no one can explain how. Let the weight of those stones settle around you like something immense and quiet. Heavy stone walls, fitted together in the darkness, holding something in or keeping something out. The joints between them so tight that no air passes through. You are very still now. The weight of sleep is settling on you like warm stone, solid, ancient, certain. You are safe inside these walls. The fifth thing Tartaria built that we still cannot rebuild is the free energy architecture. This is the heart of the Tartaria theory for many researchers. The claim that the civilization researchers call Tartaria had access to and had built civilization around a source of energy that was free. Not cheap, not renewable in the modern sense. Free, as in derived from processes so fundamental to the physics of the Earth and the universe that they cost nothing to access, required no fuel, and produced no waste. The case begins with the buildings themselves. Throughout the 1800s, there was a period of extraordinary construction in cities across North America and Europe. Cities that had recently been settled, or had small populations, or were allegedly still frontier towns, were suddenly acquiring buildings of stunning grandeur. Buildings with massive columns of quarried stone. Buildings with domes covered in real gold leaf. Buildings with interior spaces of cathedral scale, with marble floors and carved stone ceilings and wrought iron work of extraordinary intricacy. These buildings cost, in modern equivalent terms, amounts that make no economic sense for the cities that supposedly built them. A city of 50,000 people in 1860s America, largely funded by trade and agriculture, simply did not have the economic resources to build what the photographic record shows it building. The math does not work, the timelines do not work, the available labor force does not work, unless the building was already there. This is one of the most provocative elements of the Tartaria theory. The claim that what historians describe as a great era of civic construction in the 19th century was actually an era of occupation and repurposing. That the civilization that reset after the mud flood, our civilization, moved into buildings that were already built, stripped them of their original functions and furnishings, and began using them for their own purposes, while constructing an official history that credited the buildings to themselves. The evidence offered for this includes the lack of records. For buildings that supposedly took decades and millions of dollars to build, the paper trails are strangely thin. Construction plans that cannot be located. Architect names attached to buildings they supposedly designed, but whose other documented work bears no resemblance to the structures credited to them. Photographs from the early years of photography, showing cities already fully built, already ancient-looking, already inhabited by the kind of dense, permanent civilization that supposedly took generations to develop, and photographs of the interiors, the exhibition halls, the World's Fair buildings, the old train stations and city halls and universities. These interiors show not the raw, functional spaces of new construction, but the layered ornamentation of something much older. Tilework of extraordinary complexity, ceiling paintings of sophisticated iconography, heating and ventilation systems that, when their remains are examined, cannot be explained by the technology supposedly available at the time of construction. The free energy systems, according to this theory, were the power source for all of it. The buildings were designed to receive energy from the earth and the sky, to distribute it through their electrical systems, to use it for heating and lighting and mechanical functions. The spires were the antennas. The copper pipes and iron frameworks were the distribution networks. The buildings were, in a sense, living electrical systems, self-powering, maintenance-free, designed to function indefinitely on the free energy of the planet they were built on. Can we rebuild this? We understand some of the physics. Zero-point energy research exists. Researchers have demonstrated, in laboratory settings, small amounts of energy drawn from the quantum vacuum, from the Earth's electrical field, from the complex interactions between atmospheric electricity and ground conductivity. But we have no working large-scale system. We have no architecture that functions as an energy receiver at building scale. We have the theory, in fragments. We do not have the practice. And according to the Tartaria researchers, we once did. And it was taken from us, not by accident, not by the slow forgetting of time, but deliberately, stripped out of the buildings by the new civilization that moved in after the reset. The copper removed for salvage, the iron frameworks dismantled, the antenna structures replaced with decorative but non-functional reproductions, and the buildings left standing, beautiful and dead, their energy systems gone, waiting for someone to ask why the architect included that strange copper framework in the basement, why the building plan shows a room that no door leads to, why the heating system works in a way that no furnace or boiler can account for. The questions are there. The answers were taken away. Let that thought drift through you now, soft and strange. The idea that the buildings around you, the old beautiful buildings of the cities of the world, were once alive in a way they are no longer. That they hummed and glowed and breathed with a power drawn from the sky and the earth. That the silence in them now is the silence of something that was shut off, not something that was never running. The silence has a texture. The darkness behind your closed eyes has a warmth. Sleep is very close now. The sixth thing Tartaria built that we still cannot rebuild is the global canal network. Water is civilization. Every great civilization in human history has understood this and has built its civilization around water. Rivers, aqueducts, harbors, canals. The ability to move water and to move goods and people on water is so fundamental to the development of complex societies that historians of technology sometimes describe the great hydraulic civilizations. The civilizations that mastered water management as the foundational template for all human organization. Alternative Tartaria researchers look at the water infrastructure of the pre-modern world and ask, again, the quiet question, how? The Roman aqueducts are the most famous example, structures of extraordinary engineering, moving water across hundreds of kilometers through channels cut with remarkable precision, maintaining the precise gradient needed to keep water flowing without pumps, entirely by gravity. The gradient required for this is very small, a few centimeters per kilometer, and maintaining it across a long distance, over hills and valleys, through tunnels and over stone arches, requires survey instruments of high precision and engineering knowledge of a sophisticated order. We know Roman engineering was sophisticated. We have the evidence. But alternative researchers point to infrastructure that predates Rome, that is attributed to no civilization, that simply exists in the landscape as if it grew there. Ancient canal systems in Australia, traced by archaeologists as ancient Aboriginal fish traps and water management systems, extend for hundreds of kilometers through the landscape, in forms so large and so regular that their construction by small nomadic populations with primitive tools strains credulity. Similar systems in the American Southwest. In the Amazon basin, where beneath the rainforest canopy, researchers using LIDAR have found canal networks extending for thousands of kilometers, connecting ancient settlements whose population and technological level supposedly made such infrastructure impossible. In South America, the raised field agriculture systems, vast networks of canals and elevated planting beds that covered millions of acres and managed water with extraordinary precision. In Cambodia, the great hydraulic systems of the Khmer civilization, canals and reservoirs on a scale that rivals modern irrigation projects, built supposedly by a civilization with no metal tools and no wheeled vehicles, and in Siberia, of all places. In the vast wetlands and river systems of what was labeled Great Tartaria on early maps, researchers have identified ancient canal systems connecting river basins across thousands of kilometers. These canals, if they exist as described, would represent a feat of engineering on the scale of the Panama Canal, multiplied many times over in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The alternative Tartaria narrative holds that the Tartarian civilization was the great hydraulic civilization, that the global distribution of these ancient canal systems represents the infrastructure of a single interconnected world system, a network of waterways that allowed travel and trade across the entire northern hemisphere, maintained by a civilization that understood water management at a planetary scale, and that the mud flood, or whatever catastrophic event ended the Tartarian civilization, disrupted this water management system catastrophically, that the flooding of lowland regions, the burial of cities under sediment, was in part the result of the failure of the systems that had been managing water across the landscape. When the management systems failed, the water moved, as water always does, to fill the lowest spaces, burying what was there with silt and mud and the slow, patient work of centuries. What was lost was not just the civilization, it was the knowledge of how to maintain the relationship between human settlement and water at planetary scale. We have been relearning this knowledge ever since, at great cost, building dams and levees and canals and irrigation systems that solve local problems while creating distant ones, never quite recapturing the integration that the global system supposedly represented. Can we rebuild it? We can build canals. The Panama Canal is a masterpiece of modern engineering, but a planetary network of integrated waterways, managed as a single system, maintaining the water balance of entire continents, functioning with the kind of low-maintenance, long-duration reliability that these ancient systems apparently achieved? No, we do not know how. We do not have the knowledge or the organizational framework or the understanding of hydrology at that scale. The water moves, it always has, it always will. And somewhere beneath the silt at the bottom of old riverbeds, there are stones that once formed the walls of canals that the world has forgotten. Let the sound of water find you now. Quiet water, moving slowly through a channel in the night. Cool and dark and certain of its direction. Following a path laid down long ago by hands we cannot name. Let that sound carry you. Further, deeper. The night holds you like water holds a boat. Gently, without effort, without resistance. Rest. The seventh thing Tartaria built that we still cannot rebuild is the most personal, the most intimate, the most difficult to examine through the distance of history or the clarity of daylight. The seventh thing Tartaria built was a different kind of human being. Or perhaps more precisely, the seventh thing Tartaria knew was a different understanding of what a human being is. This is where the alternative history theory of Tartaria opens into something larger. Something that is not primarily about buildings or technology at all, but about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between the human nervous system and the world it lives in. The case begins, as so many of these cases do, with the buildings. Why were they so beautiful? This is a question that sounds simple, but is actually quite deep. The civic buildings of the 19th century, the ones alternative researchers identify as Tartarian remnants, are not just functional. They are extraordinarily, almost irrationally beautiful. The level of ornamental detail in a typical old city hall or university building or train station from this period is wildly in excess of any practical requirement. The carved stone flowers on the facade, the painted ceilings, the inlaid marble floors, the bronze door handles shaped like mythological creatures, the ironwork staircases that are simultaneously structural elements and sculptures. Why? If the goal was simply to build a building that functioned as a city hall or a train station, none of this was necessary. Beauty on this scale is not functional in the ordinary sense, unless it is functional in an extraordinary sense. Alternative researchers, particularly those working at the intersection of the Tartaria theory and research into the effects of environment on human consciousness, argue that the beauty of these buildings was not decorative. It was medicinal. It was nutritive. That human beings, when surrounded by certain kinds of beauty, particularly beauty that exhibits the mathematical proportions found in nature, the golden ratio, fractal self-similarity, specific harmonic relationships between parts, enter states of neurological coherence that enhance health, creativity, perception, and well-being. There is modern research that supports this at the margins. Studies on the relationship between natural fractal patterns and human stress response. Research on the neurological effects of architectural proportion. Work in the field of biophilic design suggesting that built environments can be designed to support or suppress human flourishing at a physiological level. The Tartaria theory extends this into something more radical. The claim that the civilization researchers call Tartaria understood human consciousness as a field phenomenon. That individual human awareness was understood not as something that happens inside the skull, but as something that extends into and is shaped by the environment and can be intentionally cultivated by designing that environment with knowledge of how consciousness and space interact. The combination of acoustic architecture, free energy systems, megalithic stone with specific resonant properties, geometric structures aligned to earth energies, and beauty designed to induce neurological coherence. This combination, the theory holds, created environments in which human beings functioned differently, more clearly, more creatively, more connected to each other and to the natural world, more aware of dimensions of experience that the purely sensory human animal normally cannot access. The old traditions called these dimensions by many names: the subtle body, the etheric realm, the akashic field. Modern researchers in consciousness studies use more measured language: non-local consciousness, the quantum mind, extended perception. Whatever the name, the claim is the same. The architecture of the Tartarian civilization was designed to facilitate states of human awareness that go beyond ordinary sensory experience. And by doing so, it created a civilization whose relationship to knowledge, to nature, to each other, and to the cosmos was fundamentally different from anything that has existed in the documented history of our own civilization. This, more than the stone technology or the energy systems or the canal networks, is what we cannot rebuild. Not because the materials are not available, not because the knowledge has been completely lost, but because we do not yet agree that what was lost was real. We do not yet agree that consciousness extends beyond the skull. We do not yet agree that architecture can be medicine. We do not yet agree that human beings are capable of forms of perception and experience that our current environments systematically suppress. And so we cannot build for those capabilities because we have not yet admitted that we have them. This is the deepest mystery of the Tartaria theory. Not the stone walls or the ether antennas or the star forts. Those are mysteries of technology, and technology can in principle be rediscovered. The deepest mystery is the human being who built all of it. Who knew things about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to matter and space and energy that we are only beginning to approach? Who built a world designed to support the full flowering of human awareness, and who, along with everything they built, was erased, or was forgotten, or is waiting? It is very late now. The night has grown soft and deep around you. Your breathing is slow. Your body is heavy with the pleasant heaviness of approaching sleep. The story has carried you a long way. Let us close, quietly. 7 technologies, 7 mysteries, 7 things built by hands that have been forgotten, for purposes we are still learning to understand. The ether antennas, reaching toward the sky from the tops of old buildings in 100 cities, drawing something down from the atmosphere, distributing it through the walls and floors of structures that needed no fuel. The acoustic architecture, chambers and domes and curved stone walls designed to produce frequencies that altered consciousness, that healed, that expanded awareness beyond the ordinary range of human perception. The star fort network, geometric mandalas of earth and stone scattered across the planet at precise intervals, connected to each other and to the energy fields of the earth in ways we cannot yet measure, but perhaps can feel. The megalithic stonework, walls of 360-ton granite polygons fitted together with tolerances that modern machinery cannot match, cut and placed by a technology that left no tool marks and no explanation. The free energy architecture, buildings that were alive with a power drawn from the earth and the sky, self-sustaining systems that needed no fuel and produced no waste and functioned indefinitely until someone turned them off. The global canal network, waterways stretching across continents, managing the movement of water at planetary scale with an integration and a precision that our own water management systems have never approached. And the human being, the 7th mystery, the person who built all of this, who knew things about consciousness and reality that we are still working our way back toward, who lived in environments designed for human flourishing at its fullest possible expression. Where did they go? Some researchers say the mud flood took them, a catastrophic reset, an event perhaps natural, perhaps not, that buried their world and gave our world a blank and muddy canvas to build a new story on. Some say they are still here, that the genetic lineage continues, that the knowledge survived, encoded in folklore and sacred geometry and the architectural proportions of the buildings they left behind, waiting for someone who knows how to read it. Some say the question itself is the point, that asking it, sincerely, opens something in the mind, a door that looks like a historical mystery but opens into something much closer to home. You do not need to answer tonight. Tonight, you only need to sleep. The old buildings are still standing in the cities of the world. The stone walls fit together without explanation. The spires point toward the sky. The star forts hold their perfect geometry in the earth. The stones are cut more precisely than anything we know how to cut. And somewhere in the pattern of all of it, in the proportions, and the alignments, and the acoustic frequencies, and the geometric relationships, there is a message. A very long and patient message, written in stone and copper and earth, by hands that are gone, for eyes that are still here. Read it slowly. There is no hurry. The night is long. The sleep is deep. The stones have been waiting this long, and they can wait a little longer. Close your eyes. Let the weight of sleep come fully now. Let the warmth of it settle around you like the walls of an old building, thick and solid and certain. Let the soft frequency of a chamber carved from bedrock hum somewhere below your hearing, below your thought, in the place where the body knows things the mind has not yet learned. The stars are above the roof. The earth is below the floor. You are held between them, the way you have always been held, the way everything has always been held, in the quiet field that connects everything to everything. Sleep now. The story of Tartaria will be here in the morning. The stones will still be standing. The mystery will still be beautiful and deep and patient. But tonight there is only this: the breath, the warmth, the quiet, and sleep. Good night. Interlude. The maps that should not exist. Before we continue into the deeper layers of this story, let us pause here, in the soft space between wakefulness and sleep, and speak about maps. Maps are documents of power. They are not neutral records of geography. They are arguments about what exists, what matters, what belongs to whom, and what the world looks like when seen from the perspective of whoever is doing the mapping. Every map is a choice. Every border drawn is a decision. Every name placed on a landscape is an assertion of authority. This is why the old maps are so interesting. In the libraries and archives of Europe, in the collections of the great universities and the national libraries and the private repositories of old scholarly institutions, there are maps. Many maps. Maps going back 5 centuries to the earliest days of European cartography, when the printing press was new and the desire to document the world was intense and scholarly. And on those maps, for roughly 3 centuries, from approximately 1500 to approximately 1800, there is a label, a large label, applied to a large territory. The territory covers most of what is now Russia, much of Central Asia, parts of Eastern Europe, and the label reads Tartaria or Tartari, or, on some maps, in expanded form, the Great Tartarian Empire. This is documented historical fact. These maps exist. They are held in respectable institutions. Scholars of cartographic history have written about them. The name Tartaria was not obscure. It was not a marginal notation. It was one of the most prominent labels on the map of the known world for 3 centuries of European cartography. And then it disappeared, not gradually, not as part of a slow transition as better geographic information replaced older estimates. The cartographic record shows something more abrupt. In the late 18th and early 19th century, the maps changed. The label Tartaria was removed. The territories it had designated were relabeled. The Russian Empire expanded to cover much of the space. Other designations appeared for other parts, and Tartaria, which had been on maps for 300 years, was not on maps anymore. In historiography, in the formal academic study of history, there is an established explanation for this. The label Tartaria, scholars say, was never the name of a unified political entity. It was a geographic designation used by European cartographers to describe the vast territories of Central and North Asia that were poorly understood by European geography. It covered a range of different peoples, different political formations, different cultures, all of which were grouped under a single vague label because Europeans did not know enough to be more specific. As European geographic knowledge improved, as the Russian Empire expanded and documented its territories, as diplomatic and commercial contact with Asian peoples increased, the vague label was replaced by more specific and accurate designations. This explanation is, in broad terms, the scholarly consensus, and it may well be accurate, but alternative Tartaria researchers look at the same evidence and ask different questions. They ask, if Tartaria was merely a geographic designation for poorly understood territories, why did the maps show it with the iconography of a political entity? Why did some maps mark it with symbols denoting an empire, with capital cities, with administrative divisions? Why did the cartographers of 3 centuries of European scholarship consistently treat it not as a wilderness of unnamed peoples, but as a coherent political and cultural entity? They ask, why does the disappearance of the label coincide so precisely with the period that alternative researchers identify as the era of the Reset, the period after the proposed mud flood catastrophe, the period in which a new civilization was supposedly establishing itself in the remains of the old? They ask, what would it mean for official history if the label Tartaria on those maps referred not to a vague geographic designation, but to an actual political entity, an actual civilization that controlled most of the northern landmass of the planet for centuries and was then replaced by the political entities whose histories we have been taught? There is no definitive answer. There are old maps and there is uncertainty, and there are questions that official history does not find interesting and alternative researchers find impossible to ignore. And there are the other maps, the anomalous ones, the maps that show cities where cities should not be, maps that show coastlines that could only have been surveyed from positions that should have been impossible for the cartographers who supposedly made them, maps that show Antarctica without its ice, suggesting they were made when Antarctica was accessible, which, according to official geology, was thousands of years before the first claimed discovery of the continent, the Piri Reis map, the Orontius Phineus map, the Mercator maps of the Arctic showing open ocean at the pole, and a continent of detailed geography. These are documented historical artifacts held in scholarly institutions. They are not fabrications, and their existence suggests that the history of geographic knowledge is not the simple story of gradual discovery that official history presents. Somewhere in the archive, a map is waiting, a map that shows a world we have not yet been told the truth about, a world with different coastlines, different cities, different political arrangements, a different story of who was where and when and what they built. The archive is old, the pages are fragile, the ink has faded, but the shapes remain. Let the shapes of old maps drift through your mind now, the strange coastlines, the cities marked in territories that official history calls empty, the bold label of an empire that history says did not exist in the way the maps suggest it did. Let them drift, let them fade. The night holds everything. Old maps and new questions and the slow, deep breathing of a mind releasing its grip on the day's certainties. Rest. A deeper mystery. The world's fairs. There is a detail in the alternative Tartaria theory that many researchers find particularly compelling, not because it is the most dramatic piece of evidence, but because it is the most specific, the most documentable, the most difficult to explain away with comfortable conventional answers. It is the world's fairs. Between 1851 and 1915, a series of extraordinary events were held in cities across Europe and North America. They were called World's Fairs, or Universal Expositions, or International Expositions. They drew tens of millions of visitors. They showcased the achievements of industrial civilization, and they were built in the form of extraordinary temporary cities, complexes of enormous buildings that appeared almost overnight, hosted millions of people, and were then, according to the official record, torn down. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago was perhaps the most spectacular, the so-called White City, a complex of neoclassical buildings covering hundreds of acres, built in 18 months, housing exhibits from every major nation, attended by 27 million people. The buildings were finished in a white stucco that photographed brilliantly and gave the complex its name. And then, when the fair ended, they were torn down. This is the official story. Alternative researchers look at the photographs of the White City and ask questions that are increasingly difficult to dismiss. The first question concerns scale. The buildings of the 1893 exposition were enormous. Some of them covered acres. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building was the largest building in the world at the time of its construction, covering more square footage than any other single structure on Earth. It was supposedly built in 18 months with the construction technology of 1891 and 1892. The construction technology of 1891 did not include steel frame construction, which was still in its infancy. It did not include modern cranes or concrete forming systems or power tools. It included manual labor, horse-drawn equipment, and timber framing. Engineers who have looked at the 1893 exposition buildings and tried to reverse engineer how they could have been built in 18 months with available technology have consistently concluded that it was not possible. Not just difficult, not just ambitious, not possible. The second question concerns the photography. The photographs of the White City, taken in 1893, with the photographic technology of that era, show buildings of extraordinary detail and quality. Stone carvings, elaborate cornices, complex figurative sculpture integrated into facade designs. These are not things that can be produced quickly. The carving alone, on a single facade of a major exposition building, would have required years of skilled stone carvers working continuously, even with the large workforce supposedly employed at the fair. The third question concerns the aftermath. The official story is that the exposition buildings were torn down after the fair closed, but alternative researchers have found evidence that complicates this story. Contemporary newspaper accounts that describe some of the buildings as too substantial to easily demolish. Photographs taken after the supposed demolition that show structures still standing. Maps of Chicago from years after the 1893 exposition that show the exhibition grounds occupied by buildings that were supposedly destroyed. What is the alternative explanation? That the White City was not built in 18 months, that it was already there, that the exposition was hosted in a complex of buildings that had been built by the earlier civilization, by the entity researchers called Tartaria, that were repurposed for the fair and then, after the fair, repurposed again for other uses, some torn down, some converted, some still standing in modified forms. The alternative researchers point to other world's fairs with similar anomalies. The 1867 Paris Exposition, hosted in a building so large that it enclosed acres of interior space, supposedly built and torn down in a matter of months. The 1889 Exposition Universelle, famous for the Eiffel Tower, but also hosting dozens of massive, permanent-seeming buildings, most of which were demolished shortly afterward with suspicious ease. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, which left behind a permanent institution, the Missouri History Museum, but whose main exposition palace was reportedly demolished in days by a fire that happened to destroy the evidence. Fire is a recurring element in this catalogue of anomalies. Many of the major exposition buildings burned. Many of the old beautiful buildings that alternative researchers identify as Tartarian remnants burned. The Chicago Fire of 1871, which destroyed a large portion of the city. The San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, which destroyed most of that city. The countless individual fires that destroyed old courthouses, old city halls, old train stations, old university buildings across the 19th and early 20th centuries. Fire destroys evidence. It turns stone to rubble and wood to ash and paper to nothing. It makes buildings disappear in a way that demolition does not, because demolition leaves debris that can be examined. while fire leaves only ash and the truncated stumps of foundations. Alternative researchers note the suspicious frequency with which important old buildings burned in the period they identify as the era of the Reset. And they wonder whether all of these fires were accidents. These are dark thoughts for a story told at the edge of sleep, and we will not dwell in them. The darkness of the theory is not where we are resting tonight. We are resting in the beauty of the mystery, in the strange and generous question of what was built, and how, and why, and for whom. Let the photographs of the White City float through your closing mind. The white buildings reflected in the lagoon at night. The electric lights, some of the first electric lights used at a major public event. The crowds of people dressed in the clothes of a century ago, moving through spaces of extraordinary grandeur, looking up at columns and domes and carved stone faces, experiencing something so beautiful that they wrote about it for the rest of their lives. Whatever those buildings were, whatever the true story of their origin, they were beautiful. The people who saw them said they were the most beautiful things they had ever seen. Something beautiful existed, and beauty, in whatever form and from whatever source, is its own kind of truth. Let that beauty be with you now, in the warm darkness behind your closed eyes, in the slow quiet of your breathing, in the space where sleep and story dissolve into each other. The Tartarian script and language. One of the quieter pieces of evidence cited by alternative Tartaria researchers concerns language and writing. The civilizations that history has documented and preserved, the civilizations whose stories fill our textbooks, left behind their languages. Latin gave us the Romance languages of Europe. Sanskrit gave us the Indo-Aryan languages of South Asia. Ancient Greek gave us the Greek of the New Testament and the echo of philosophical vocabulary that runs through every European language. Sumerian and Akkadian were deciphered and read, and their literature recovered. Egyptian hieroglyphics, once understood only in fragments of legend, were decoded in the 19th century and revealed a civilization rich with recorded thought. The pattern is clear. Great civilizations leave their languages. Languages survive in inscriptions, in manuscripts, in the words borrowed by successor cultures. A civilization as vast and long-lasting as the Tartaria of the old maps should have left its language everywhere. In place, names, in borrowed vocabulary, in architectural inscriptions on its buildings, in the folk languages of the peoples who lived within its territory. And here, the alternative researchers identify something interesting. The languages of the peoples who lived within the territory of historic Tartaria are extraordinarily diverse. The Turkic language family, the Mongolic family, the Tungusic family, Siberian languages of no known affiliation. The diversity suggests that these were not the primary language communities of a unified civilization, but rather the survivors, the remnant populations of something that came before. But they do identify patterns. Certain root words that appear in languages spread across the Tartarian territory with a consistency that suggests, some argue, a common ancestral vocabulary. Words relating to water and sky and stone and fire. The fundamental vocabulary of a civilization built around natural forces that appear in cognate forms across an extraordinary geographic range. More intriguingly, they point to the decorative inscriptions on old buildings in the architectural tradition they identify as Tartarian. Many of the old civic buildings in European and American cities have inscriptions carved into their facades. Some of these are clearly Latin, some are in the national languages of the countries where the buildings stand. But some, particularly on older elements of the buildings, on the structural stonework that alternative researchers argue predates the named official construction, carry inscriptions that do not match any identified script. These inscriptions are generally assumed to be decorative, geometric patterns mistaken for script by untrained observers. But some researchers have argued that they represent a real writing system, one that has not yet been deciphered, because scholars have not yet accepted that there is a civilization for it to belong to. This is a circular problem. The script cannot be studied because the civilization is not acknowledged. The civilization cannot be acknowledged because the evidence, including the script, has not been studied. The circle holds. What would it mean if the inscriptions on old buildings in the cities of the world were actually a written language? What would it mean if the carved geometric patterns on the facades of old train stations and city halls and university buildings, patterns that generations of architects have described as purely ornamental, were actually text? What would it mean to live your whole life walking past buildings that were saying something in a language no one alive has yet learned to read? The stones speak. We have simply not yet learned to listen. There is a kind of listening that happens in sleep, a different mode of processing, less constrained by the assumptions of the waking mind, more open to patterns that the analytical faculty overlooks. The dream state processes information that the waking state screens out. Languages that the conscious mind has no framework for sometimes reach the dreaming mind in the form of feeling, of tone, of a sense of meaning that cannot quite be articulated, but is unmistakably present. Perhaps this is why these stories are told at the edge of sleep, because the questions they carry do not have waking answers, because the kind of knowing they point toward is not the knowing of analysis and argument, but something quieter, more fundamental, more like recognition than discovery. You have always known something about this. Some part of you has always felt the weight of what is not in the history books. The sense that the world is older and stranger and richer than the story you were given. The feeling, standing in a very old building, that the building remembers things its official history does not mention. That feeling is real. Whatever its explanation, it is real. And tonight, in the space between sleeping and waking, it is yours to rest in. The reset. Hypothesis. What happened in the 19th century? Let us step back. Let us look at the full picture that alternative Tartaria researchers paint. Not just the individual pieces, but the whole. The hypothesis, stated plainly, is this. At some point, most likely in the 18th or early 19th century, a catastrophic event occurred. This event was widespread in its geographic scope, covering at minimum the northern hemisphere. It produced what the researchers call the mud flood, a massive movement of water and sediment that buried the lower portions of existing built structures across a vast area. It killed a substantial portion of the existing population, and it disrupted, perhaps catastrophically, the energy and infrastructure systems of the civilization that had been living in those structures. In the aftermath, survivors rebuilt, but the survivors were not the same people who had built the original civilization. They were, at most, its distant remnants, populations that had been on the periphery of the great civilization, or in sheltered locations, or in regions that the catastrophe affected less severely. They had fragments of knowledge and tradition, stories and legends and craft skills, but they had lost the systematic understanding that had built the great energy systems and the precise stone architecture and the global canal networks, or the survivors were a different population entirely, a conquering population that arrived after the catastrophe into a world of extraordinary, ready-made buildings and claimed them, and claimed along with them the narrative authority to write the history of those buildings, to assert that they had built what they had merely inherited. The new civilization moved into the existing buildings. It repurposed them. A building designed as an energy reception facility became a city hall. A building designed as an acoustic resonance chamber became a concert hall. A building designed as a transit node in a global infrastructure network became a train station. The original functions were lost, but the buildings remained, too substantial to tear down, too beautiful to ignore, repurposed but not replaced. And a new history was written, a history that placed the construction of these buildings in the recent past, attributed them to architects whose names could be invented and biographies fabricated, as heir to funded them with budgets that made no economic sense, but that no one was in a position to audit, and integrated them into a story of gradual progressive development from primitive beginnings to civilized sophistication. The story was taught in schools. It was printed in textbooks. It was reinforced by the authority of institutions that themselves occupied the buildings whose history they were revising. And over generations, it became so thoroughly embedded in the culture that questioning it felt not just unlikely, but somehow wrong. somehow dangerous to the fundamental stability of the story by which people organize their understanding of who they were and where they came from. This is not a unique pattern in human history. History is full of cases in which a new power structure revised the historical record to legitimize itself and erase what came before. The burning of libraries is a recurring motif. The deliberate destruction of monuments and inscriptions by new political orders is documented. The rewriting of religious and cultural traditions to serve new rulers is a constant of human political life. What is different about the Tartaria hypothesis, if it is true, is the scale. Not the revision of a local or regional history, the revision of the history of the entire world. Not the destruction of a particular archive, the destruction of the conceptual framework that made the preceding civilization possible. The knowledge of free energy, of acoustic architecture, of megalithic construction, of the relationship between human consciousness and the designed environment. The scale of the hypothetical erasure matches the scale of the hypothetical civilization. A planetary civilization would require a planetary erasure. And the tool for a planetary erasure was, and remains, the educational system. The story told to every child, in every school, in every country, about who we are and where we came from and what is and is not possible. Alternative Tartaria researchers are not, for the most part, arguing that this story was false in every particular. They are arguing that it has a large and significant hole in it, that the hole is shaped exactly like a civilization, and that the edges of the hole are visible, to those who know how to look, in the impossible precision of ancient stonework and the anomalous grandeur of 19th century civic buildings and the 3 centuries of European maps that show a great empire where official history says there was nothing. This is a large thought for the edge of sleep, too large to hold all at once. Let it be what it is, a question mark of extraordinary size, hanging in the dark of your closed-eye world, like a star whose light takes a very long time to reach you. The light is old. It left its source before you were born. It is arriving now, here, in the quiet of your night, in the soft space between waking and sleeping, where the mind is open enough to receive it. You do not need to decide what it means tonight. Tonight, you only need to let it arrive. The orphan, trains and the repopulation theory. There is a thread within the Tartaria alternative history community that ventures further into provocation than most, and it deserves a careful, measured introduction. Some researchers, examining the 19th century and record not of buildings but of people, have proposed that the resettlement of North America after the hypothetical reset was conducted deliberately and systematically, and they point to a documented historical phenomenon as evidence: the orphan train movement. The orphan trains were real. This is established history. Between approximately 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from cities on the east coast of the United States, primarily New York, to rural areas of the Midwest and beyond. The trains were organized by charitable organizations, primarily the Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace. The children were placed with farm families across the expanding territories of the American interior. Official history describes this as a humanitarian effort. New York and other eastern cities had very large populations of orphaned, abandoned, and destitute children. The charitable solution was to find them homes with rural families who needed labor and who could provide the children with a more wholesome environment than the urban tenements. Alternative researchers look at the orphan trains and ask different questions. Where did 250,000 orphans come from? Even accounting for high rates of disease and poverty in 19th century cities, the documented scale of orphaned and abandoned children in New York in the 1850s seems anomalously large. Some researchers have suggested that the children were not orphaned by ordinary urban poverty, but by a more recent catastrophe, the same catastrophic event that the mud flood hypothesis identifies as having killed large portions of the existing population. Who were the children placed with? The standard charitable framing presents the farm families of the Midwest as the benevolent recipients of these children. But alternative researchers note that this framing also describes a deliberate population distribution. Children distributed systematically across the interior of the country by an organized program, a repopulation of territories that were, according to the mud flood hypothesis, largely emptied by the catastrophe. What happened to the cultures that were supposedly already in those territories? The 19th century was also the century of the systematic displacement of indigenous American peoples from their traditional territories. The Trail of Tears, the Indian Wars, the reservation system, the deliberate destruction of indigenous cultures and languages and ways of life by the expanding settler society. Alternative researchers sometimes ask whether the displacement of indigenous peoples from the territory that Tartaria theory identifies as formerly Tartarian was related to the repopulation effort, whether the people being displaced were themselves the remnant survivors of the original civilization, who remembered the territory in ways the new population was not meant to know. These are speculative arguments, and they involve real historical tragedies, the genuine suffering of orphaned children and displaced indigenous peoples, that deserve care and respect in how they are invoked. Alternative history sometimes appropriates real historical pain to serve theoretical frameworks, and that appropriation can obscure the human reality of what those people actually experienced. But the questions are there. And the questions, even if they do not have the answers the alternative researchers propose, point toward real gaps in the official historical narrative. Real things that happened for reasons that official history presents in ways that are perhaps incomplete. 250,000 children moved across a continent over 70 years. A continent whose indigenous peoples were simultaneously being removed from the land. A continent full of old buildings, photographed in the 1860s and 1870s, that look as if they have been standing for centuries. The questions accumulate. The answers remain just out of reach. This is the nature of the Tartaria mystery. Every thread leads to another thread. Every answer opens 3 new questions. Every piece of evidence points toward a larger picture that never quite comes into full resolution. Perhaps that is because the picture is incomplete. Perhaps it is because the picture is false, a pattern-seeking mind finding connections in coincidences. Perhaps it is because the picture is real, and its full resolution is the most important intellectual project of our era. Perhaps, in sleep, some part of the mind can see more clearly. Let the threads go, let the questions dissolve. Let the image of an old train on an old track moving through an old country at night be the last image, soft and dark, and moving slowly through the dark, carrying something unnamed toward a destination that is close now, very close. The sound beneath the silence. What old buildings are still doing. We have spoken tonight of energy systems and acoustic chambers and free energy architecture. But there is a practical, measurable dimension to this that is worth pausing with. Old buildings behave differently from new buildings. This is an observation made by architects, acousticians, engineers, and ordinary people who have spent time in both. The difference is not just aesthetic, though it is certainly that. It is physical and measurable. Old stone buildings maintain temperature in ways that modern construction does not. The thermal mass of thick stone walls smooths out temperature swings. A well-built stone building from the 19th century or earlier stays cool in summer and warm in winter with almost no mechanical assistance. The energy efficiency of these buildings, when measured against modern standards, is extraordinary, not because they had better insulation in the modern sense, but because the mass of their construction absorbed and released heat in a way that functioned almost like a living system. Old stone buildings absorb and re-emit sound differently from modern construction. The frequency response of old stone, particularly old granite and limestone that has been in place for centuries, is different from new stone, different from modern concrete, different from steel and glass. The material itself changes with time. The crystalline structure of old stone, subjected to centuries of thermal cycling and the slow movement of water and the constant low-level vibration of the world, achieves a kind of acoustic maturity that is difficult to replicate in new material. Musicians who have recorded in old stone buildings, in old churches and old castles, and old university halls consistently describe the acoustic character of these spaces as irreproducible in modern facilities. The way the room contributes to the sound, the specific quality of the reverb, which is not just long or short, but somehow alive, somehow responsive, as if the room is participating in the music rather than merely containing it. Old stone buildings register, on sensitive equipment, low-frequency vibrations that modern buildings do not. Part of this is structural. Heavy stone has natural resonant frequencies in the infrasound range, below 20 Hz, that affect human physiology in ways that are well documented, if not well understood. Infrasound can induce sensations of unease, of presence, of meaning, of awe. Cathedrals have always been places where people felt something. Neurological research suggests that part of what they felt was generated by the infrasound characteristics of the stone structure itself. If the old buildings were designed to produce these effects, if their dimensions and materials and geometries were chosen with knowledge of how infrasound and acoustic resonance affect human consciousness, then what feels to us like the mysterious quality of old places, the something that old buildings have, that new buildings do not, is not nostalgia or projection. It is a real, measurable, physiological effect, produced by design. The old buildings are still working, not at full capacity, not the way they were intended to work, if the Tartaria hypothesis is correct about their original purpose. The energy systems are gone. The acoustic systems are no longer calibrated by the original designers. The buildings have been modified, renovated, adapted for purposes their builders did not intend. And yet, the stone remembers. The resonant frequencies of the material itself, the geometric relationships that have not been changed, the thermal mass that has been in place for generations, these continue to function. Quietly, without acknowledgement, without anyone asking why the room feels the way it feels, or why a person who spends time in these spaces often reports feeling different in ways they cannot quite articulate. Grounded. That is the word people most often use. They feel grounded, present, clear, connected to something they do not have a name for, but recognize as important. The buildings are still doing something. Whatever they were designed to do, they are still doing a version of it, even in their diminished and repurposed state. And when you sleep tonight, in whatever structure surrounds you, the materials of that structure are resonating at frequencies below your hearing, with the planet beneath you and the atmosphere above you, and the quiet movement of energy through the night. This is not metaphor. This is physics. Everything resonates. The question the Tartaria hypothesis raises is simply whether some structures resonate in ways that have been consciously designed to interact with human consciousness, and whether that design represents a knowledge that has been lost and might be recovered. Your body knows how to receive this. It has always known. The knowledge is in the architecture of your nervous system, which is older than any building, older than any civilization, which has been receiving the frequencies of the world for as long as your species has existed. You are resonating, right now, with the night around you, with the earth beneath you, with the sky above the roof, with the quiet hum of everything that is alive and in contact and present. This is the oldest technology. This is the one that was never lost. The body's capacity to receive and respond to the world it is embedded in. Feel it now, the low, quiet vibration of the earth, the soft frequency of darkness, the hum of sleep coming up through the floor. Mudflood. Evidence. Reading the landscape. There is a particular kind of looking that the alternative history researchers call mudflood investigation, and it involves not old documents or old maps, but the built landscape itself, examined with fresh eyes, as if for the first time. It begins with the windows. In old European cities, there are buildings whose windows at street level do not sit where windows should sit. They are too low. They are set into the ground rather than above it. The sill is below the pavement. The glass looks not out onto the street, but onto the concrete edge of a trench or light well that has been dug to give the window access to light and air. Official architectural history describes these as basement windows. The rooms they serve are basement rooms, storage areas and utility spaces, sometimes servants' quarters, occupying the below-grade portion of the building. But look at the windows themselves. Look at their proportions. Look at their ornamental surrounds. The carved stone frames and decorative lintels and the elegant ironwork screens. These are not basement windows. These are ground floor windows that have been buried. The rooms they serve, accessed now from the street by descending stairs, were designed as ground floor rooms with the proportions and the finishes and the natural light access of ground floor rooms. The ground rose around them. Something put a meter, 2 meters, sometimes more, of fill between the original street level and the current street level. Something buried the lower floors of buildings that were standing when that something arrived. Alternative researchers call this the signature of the mud flood, and they find it everywhere. In the old quarters of European cities, in the old downtowns of American cities, where the oldest buildings show exactly this pattern of buried lower stories. In cities in Asia and in the Middle East and in South America. The fill material varies. Sometimes it is clearly sediment, the kind of deposit left by moving water. Sometimes it is composed of rubble, broken building materials, as if many buildings were destroyed and their remains spread across the landscape before the surface was leveled. Sometimes it appears to be deliberate landfill, engineered fill brought in to raise the grade. The timing, according to alternative researchers, was the 19th century. The period after the hypothetical reset, a period when, in city after city, there were massive civic works projects, the laying of new roads and sewers, the leveling of grades, the development of the street infrastructure of the modern city. Official history describes these projects as the engineering of new cities by a rapidly developing industrial civilization. Alternative researchers describe them as covering the evidence, the raising of street grades, the filling of the sunken spaces, the paving over of the archaeological evidence of a preceding civilization, whose buildings were being repurposed above the new grade level, while everything below it was sealed under fill. The evidence for this, they argue, is in the cross-sections. When modern utility work is done in old city centres, when trenches are dug for pipes and cables, when the ground is opened, the stratigraphy sometimes shows exactly what the theory predicts. Not the gradual build-up of centuries of occupation that urban archaeology normally expects to find, but a relatively thin layer of 19th and 20th century material sitting directly on top of something much older, with very little of the expected intermediate occupation between them. The layer that should document gradual development is missing. The record jumps from very old to 19th century without the expected steps between. Something happened in between that left no gradual record, something sudden. The flood hypothesis says it literally buried the record. The water came, the mud came with it, the lower levels of buildings went under, the ground level rose, and when the water receded, the new civilization built its streets on top of what the mud left behind. This is the theory. The evidence is real, in the sense that the buried first floors and the stratigraphic anomalies are real. The interpretation is contested. Official archaeology has explanations for all of these phenomena that do not require a catastrophic flood. The debates are technical and specific and ongoing, but the buried windows are there, in the old cities, if you know to look for them. Below the current street level, behind their ironwork screens, looking out onto the concrete walls of their rescued trenches, the old windows wait. On the other side of their glass, in the rooms that are half underground, something was left when the water came. Something quiet, something patient, something that does not mind waiting in the dark. Your eyes are closed. The darkness behind them is its own kind of depth. There are things in that darkness that you have not yet examined. Thoughts and images and memories and questions from deeper in your history than tonight's particular day. Let them rest there. Let the dark have them. The weight of sleep is complete now, or nearly so. The story has done what stories told at the edge of sleep are meant to do. Not to be resolved, not to be concluded, not to leave you with answers, but to occupy the mind gently, to move through it like a slow river, through a landscape it has known for a long time, and to carry the day's particular alertness away with it as it passes. The Tartaria mystery will still be there tomorrow. The old buildings will still stand in the cities of the world. The stones will still be fitted together with impossible precision. The spires will still reach toward the sky. The star forts will still hold their geometry in the earth. And you will still be here, breathing slowly, warm, safe, heavy with sleep. This is what remains when the story is done. This, just this, the breath, the warmth, the darkness, the weight of your body against the surface that holds it. Nothing to do, nowhere to be, nothing to understand or resolve or decide. Only sleep, only the long, soft, certain night, only rest. Final passage, the dream of Tartaria. Somewhere in the sleep that is coming for you now, in the country of the night that you are entering, there may be a dream. In the dream, you are standing in a city, but it is not quite any city you have visited in waking life. The buildings are large and beautiful, and old in a way that is different from the oldness of the cities you know. The stonework is perfect. The proportions are right in a way that you feel in your chest, rather than see with your eyes. The air has a quality of resonance, as if the space itself is vibrating at a frequency just below what the ear can catch. There are other people in the dream city. They move through the streets with a quality of ease, of presence that is also different from the waking world. They know where they are going and why. They are not hurried, they are not anxious. They have the unhurried certainty of people who are exactly where they belong. The buildings are lit from within, not by electricity, not by anything you have a name for, but by something that comes from the stone itself, from the earth below and the sky above, channeled through the structures into a warm and constant light. You walk through the streets of this city, and you feel something you have not felt often enough in the waking world. You feel recognized by the buildings, by the proportions, by the frequency that hums below hearing. Whatever this place was built for, you are what it was built for. This is a space designed for a human being, and you are a human being, and the fit is exact and complete. You walk until the street opens into a plaza. In the center of the plaza, there is a fountain, and the water of the fountain speaks the way water speaks, in the language of movement and light, and you stand beside it, and you understand, without words, something about what this place was. It was home. Not to you specifically, in the biographical sense, but to something in you, to the part of you that is older than your life, older than your family, older than the civilization you were born into, to the part of you that is made of the same stuff as the stones in these walls, and the water in this fountain, and the earth under your feet, to the part of you that resonates. The dream begins to soften at the edges. The city grows light. The way all dreams grow, light when morning is coming or when deep sleep is taking over. The people in the streets become shapes. The buildings become suggestions. The fountain becomes the sound of water and then becomes the sound of your own breathing. You are going deeper, past the dream, past the image, into the place where sleep keeps the things it knows and does not tell the waking mind, into the quiet, into the dark, into the warmth, into the rest that is always waiting for you. Every night with the patience of something very old. Sleep. You are home. Good night. The medicine towers. What the architecture of healing looks like. There is a category of building in the architectural record of the 19th century that receives almost no attention from official historians, but that alternative Tartaria researchers have returned to again and again as one of the most suggestive pieces of evidence for a lost civilization. With a fundamentally different understanding of human health, these buildings were called sanitariums, or sometimes asylums, or tuberculosis hospitals, or hydrotherapy institutes, and they are found scattered across the landscape of North America and Europe and beyond in numbers that seem disproportionate to the populations they supposedly served, in locations that seem carefully chosen, in architectural forms that are far more elaborate than the functional requirements of a medical facility would demand. The classic 19th century sanitarium was a large building, often of several stories, with extensive grounds, elaborate ventilation systems, high ceilings, and a consistent architectural vocabulary that emphasized light, air, and the relationship between the interior and the natural landscape. Many of them had central towers, sometimes of great height, that served no obvious structural or ventilation purpose. Many had elaborate water systems, both for drinking and for therapeutic immersion, that suggest an advanced understanding of the relationship between water and human health. Many were built on hilltops or on the elevated banks of rivers or on coastlines, always in locations with strong prevailing winds and dramatic natural landscapes. The official history of the sanitarium movement is straightforward. The 19th century was the great era of tuberculosis, a disease that killed a substantial portion of the urban population of industrializing nations. The medical understanding of the era, before antibiotics, held that the best treatment for tuberculosis and many other diseases was fresh air, sunlight, rest, and good nutrition. The sanitarium was the architectural expression of this belief, a building designed to provide the optimal healing environment. This explanation is not wrong, but alternative researchers argue that it is incomplete. They point to the locations. The sites chosen for sanitariums were not chosen randomly, even within the general criteria of elevation and clean air. They cluster, when their locations are mapped, in patterns that suggest awareness of something more specific. They appear at sites of geomagnetic anomaly, where the Earth's magnetic field has local variations measurable by modern instruments. They appear at sites of high telluric current density, where the movement of natural electrical currents through the Earth's crust is particularly strong. They appear at sites that, in indigenous traditions from many cultures, were identified as places of special healing power. The convergence of the official rationale and the alternative rationale at the same locations, the sites chosen for sanitariums having both good air and good earth energy, suggests that whoever chose those sites may have been operating on multiple levels of understanding simultaneously. The official rationale was the justification offered to an era that understood medicine in terms of air and sun and nutrition. The actual rationale may have included knowledge of earth energies that era was not prepared to publicly acknowledge. And the central towers of the great sanitariums are difficult to explain on purely ventilation or architectural grounds. They are elaborate, they are expensive, they are often constructed of materials with specific electrical conductivity, copper cladding, iron frameworks, granite facings. They reach heights that would have been unnecessary for any structural or environmental function. Alternative researchers identify them as the same ether antennas we discussed in the first of tonight's 7 mysteries. They argue that the sanitariums were, in addition to everything else they were, free energy receivers, drawing down the atmospheric electrical potential and distributing it through the building, and that this atmospheric energy, at the correct frequency and intensity, had healing effects on the human body that the practitioners of the era recognized even if they could not fully explain. The history of electrotherapy in the 19th century supports at least part of this picture. Electrical treatments were extraordinarily popular among mainstream medicine of the era. Galvanic baths, in which patients were immersed in water through which a mild electrical current was passed. Faradic stimulation, using induced electrical currents. Electrostatic treatments, using the energy of large static electricity machines. These were not fringe remedies. They were practiced in mainstream hospitals and medical schools by trained physicians who reported genuine therapeutic results. The knowledge that electrical energy could have beneficial effects on the human body was widespread in 19th century medicine. What alternative researchers argue is that the sanitariums were designed to deliver this electrical energy, not from machines but from the earth and the sky, through the architectural systems of the building itself, at a constant low level, rather than in the intermittent high-intensity doses of the therapeutic machines. A building that hummed with free energy, in which the very act of living in the space was therapeutic, in which the frequencies of the earth and the sky, drawn through the antenna tower and distributed through the copper pipes of the heating and plumbing systems, maintained the electrical environment of the body in a state that supported healing. We cannot test this hypothesis with the sanitariums that remain, because the energy systems, if they existed, have been disconnected, dismantled, repurposed. The buildings stand, many of them converted to hotels or apartments or institutional uses. Their towers still reaching toward the sky but no longer drawing anything down. But some people who have lived in these converted spaces or who have visited them describe a quality of rest and restoration that they do not find in ordinary buildings, a quality of sleep, a quality of physical ease. Perhaps it is just the historical ambience, the high ceilings and the old stone and the beautiful grounds, or perhaps the stone remembers. Perhaps something remains in the geometry of the building, in the resonant frequencies of the old walls, in the thermal mass of the construction, that still does something. Not what it once did, not the full effect of a functioning system, but an echo, a residue, the shadow of a function that was once real. The buildings that were designed for healing still have something healing about them. Not enough to cure tuberculosis, but enough to make a person rest a little more deeply, enough to make the sleep a little more whole, like the sleep that is coming for you now, deep and quiet and restorative, as if the night itself were a sanitarium, a great quiet building of darkness and warmth, with its own tower reaching up toward the stars, drawing something down, something good, something that the body recognizes without needing to be told. Let it in. The children of Tartaria. Who remembers every tradition that has been erased leaves survivors, people who carried the old knowledge forward in fragments, in metaphor, in practice stripped of its theoretical context. The cooks who still make the old dishes even after the names of the ingredients have changed. The builders who still use the old proportions even after the reasons for those proportions have been forgotten. The healers who still know that certain places feel different, that certain materials have qualities that cannot be measured, that the body responds to the world in ways that go beyond the chemical and the mechanical. Alternative Tartaria researchers point to the persistence of certain knowledge traditions as evidence that what was lost in the reset was not completely lost. Fragments survived, not the whole system, not the engineering manuals for the ether antenna networks or the mathematical specifications for the acoustic chambers, but the knowledge that these things were real and the rough outlines of how they worked. The knowledge that certain geometric proportions support human well-being and certain others undermine it. This knowledge appears in the design traditions of cultures from Japan to Greece to indigenous America. The specific proportions vary, but the principle that proportion has a human effect, that the ratio of width to height and length to depth is not arbitrary, but meaningful, appears persistently in building traditions that have no documented historical connection to each other. The knowledge that certain materials have healing properties that go beyond their chemical composition, that certain stones, particularly crystalline stones, have qualities that interact with the human body in beneficial ways. This knowledge appears in virtually every healing tradition on Earth, from the crystal healing practices that modern medicine dismisses to the specific use of granite and quartzite in the construction of healing temples in cultures from ancient Egypt to pre-Columbian Peru. The specific practices vary, but the principle that crystalline stone interacts with the human body in ways worth understanding appears in too many independent traditions to be dismissed as pure superstition. The knowledge that the Earth has energy lines, channels of force running through the landscape, and that these lines matter for where buildings should be placed. The Chinese call them dragon lines and organize the art of placement around them through feng shui. The European traditions called them ley lines and built churches and standing stones along them. Indigenous traditions around the world have equivalent concepts, different names for the same observation that certain paths across the landscape carry something, an energy, a quality, a power. Alternative researchers argue that these persistent knowledge fragments are the survivors of the systematic knowledge of the Tartarian civilization, reduced, distorted, stripped of their theoretical framework, expressed in the mythological and symbolic languages available to the cultures that carried them forward, but real in their origin, pointing toward a coherent body of understanding about the relationship between the physical world and human consciousness and well-being that was once organized into a complete and functional technology. The traditional healer who works with crystals and the engineer who builds ether antennas are speaking, in this framework, about the same underlying reality. One in the language of intuition and tradition, the other in the language of electromagnetic physics. The language differs because the institutional framework differs. The phenomenon being addressed is the same. If this is true, then the knowledge is not fully lost. It is distributed. It exists in fragments, in healing traditions, and building traditions, and agricultural traditions, and navigational traditions across the world. The work of recovery is not to invent something new, but to recognize the fragments and understand how they fit together. To see that the healer and the engineer and the geomancer and the acoustic architect are all working with different aspects of the same knowledge. To rebuild the theoretical framework that allows the fragments to make sense as parts of a whole. Some researchers believe this work is already underway, that the convergence of quantum physics and consciousness research and ancient traditions and alternative archaeology represents the early stages of a genuine recovery of the systematic knowledge of a preceding civilization. That what is being called new science is actually old science, rediscovered in pieces by a civilization that is slowly working its way back to what it forgot. This is an optimistic reading of the evidence. It may be too optimistic. The knowledge may be more fragmented than this framework suggests. The recovery, if it is happening, may take much longer than any of us will live to see. But the fragments are real. The persistent knowledge traditions are real. The convergence of independent traditions around similar observations about energy and geometry and consciousness and place is real. And tonight, you are doing what humans have done every night for as long as there have been humans. You are returning consciousness to the source, releasing the constructed self with its anxieties and its projects and its accumulated weight of unfinished things into the larger field of rest that is always available. The field that the Tartarian civilization may have understood and built toward and designed environments to support. The field of sleep, the field of renewal, the field of the self in contact with something larger than itself. You are in it now. You have always been in it. The buildings around you are optional. The technology is secondary. The fundamental capacity, the ability of the human nervous system to release into deep rest and emerge renewed, this is what no catastrophe and no erasure and no reset of any civilization has ever touched. It is still here. It is always here. And it is yours. The Great Library and what was in it. In the ancient world, the Library of Alexandria stands as the great symbol of knowledge lost, a repository of accumulated human understanding, burned and scattered, leaving a gap in the record that scholarship has been trying to fill ever since. The Library of Alexandria is the origin myth of intellectual loss, the story that explains why we do not know more than we know, why the ancient world seems in some ways to have understood things that we are only now rediscovering. Alternative Tartaria researchers argue that the Library of Alexandria, while real and its loss genuinely tragic, was a branch library, a satellite repository. That the true library of the preceding civilization was not in Alexandria or Athens or any of the cities of the classical ancient world. It was in Tartaria. The location of the Tartarian library, or libraries, is one of the most speculative elements of the theory, because no specific site is confidently identified. But the researchers point to traditions from multiple cultures that speak of a great repository of wisdom in the north, in the high cold lands above the world of ordinary civilizations, a place where the knowledge of the ages was kept, a place that various traditions call by various names, but which share certain characteristics: remoteness, great age, extraordinary cold, and an improbable richness of accumulated human understanding. The mythological tradition of Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, a paradise of extraordinary civilization at the top of the world, appears in Greek tradition, but has parallels in the traditions of cultures across the northern hemisphere. The Tibetan tradition of Shambhala, a hidden kingdom of advanced knowledge, is similarly placed in the remote north. The Norse tradition of Asgard, home of wisdom and power, is similarly positioned. Indigenous traditions across Siberia and the Arctic speak of a time before time when the northern lands were warm and inhabited by a people of great knowledge. These traditions, alternative researchers argue, are the cultural memory of Tartaria, the mythologized remnants of stories about a real civilization in a real location, the stories that survived the reset in the form of legend, precisely because they were not written down in the manuscripts that could be deliberately destroyed, because they lived in the oral tradition of peoples who could not be reached by whatever program of erasure affected the documentary record. And in the north, in the vast and largely unexplored regions of Siberia and the Russian Arctic, researchers have found things that should not be there. Ruins in permafrost. Structures of stone in locations where, according to official history, no civilization capable of building stone structures existed. Artifacts recovered from great depth in sediment layers that date them to periods that no official archaeological narrative can accommodate. The permafrost has been preserving things. In the northern lands, the permanently frozen ground acts as a natural archive, slowing decay, preserving organic material and structural remains at depths that represent thousands of years of accumulation. And as the permafrost thaws, which it is doing with increasing rapidity in the current era of climate change, things are emerging, things that were buried not gradually, but suddenly, not by the slow accumulation of sediment over centuries, but by a rapid event that sealed them in place in an instant, geologically speaking. The animals are the most famous examples. Woolly mammoths recovered from Siberian permafrost in a state of preservation, so remarkable that their stomach contents can still be analyzed, revealing what they were eating when they died. They died suddenly. The plants in their stomachs were fresh when the animals died, not dried or fermented, as they would be in animals that died of starvation or disease over a long winter. They were grazing in a temperate environment and were then preserved instantly in permafrost. This is the catastrophic event record that the geological and biological evidence supports. Something sudden happened, something that killed large animals in the middle of their normal activity and froze them in place. Something that turned a temperate environment into a polar one essentially overnight, in geological terms. If this happened to the land, it happened to the civilization on the land. Whatever was there when the freeze came was preserved, in some cases, at depth. And as the thaw proceeds, what was preserved is emerging. The great library of Tartaria, if it existed, may still be there, in the permafrost, in the deep cold, waiting, with the patience of ice, for a world that is warm enough to receive it. This thought is too large for the edge of sleep, too vast, too cold, too deep in time. Let it go. Let the north be the north. Let the ice keep what it keeps. Let the thaw come in its own time. Tonight, there is only this room, only this warmth, only this breath. The library will wait. It has already waited this long, and you have waited long enough today for the rest that is coming now. Here it is. Here. This. The warmth. The dark. The slow exhale. Sleep. Closing. The patience of stone. We have traveled a long way tonight, further than geography can measure, into the deep past of a civilization that may or may not have existed in the form that alternative researchers describe, into the questions that old buildings ask when you look at them carefully, into the mysteries that maps and photographs and stratigraphic anomalies and acoustic chambers and precisely fitted stones accumulate into something that cannot be easily dismissed and cannot yet be fully proven. We have visited 7 impossible things: the ether antennas, the copper spires that reach toward the sky from the tops of old, beautiful buildings in cities across the world, drawing down something from the atmosphere, distributing it through the walls of structures that should not have been able to afford their own construction, powering a civilization that left no fuel source in the archaeological record. The acoustic architecture, the chambers and domes and curved stone halls that produce frequencies below and above ordinary hearing, that alter human consciousness and human physiology in measurable ways, that demonstrate a knowledge of the relationship between sound and the human nervous system that we are only now beginning to rediscover through neuroscience and clinical research. The star fort network, the geometric mandalas of earth and stone spread across the surface of the planet at precise geodetic intervals, oriented to lines of force that run through the Earth's crust and the Earth's magnetic field, serving a purpose that military architecture alone cannot explain. The megalithic stonework, the walls of 100-ton granite polygons fitted together with tolerances that modern machinery cannot match. The stones that were cut by no tool that the civilizations credited with their construction possessed. That were placed by no method that engineering can currently reproduce. The free energy architecture, the buildings that were alive with a power drawn from the sky and the earth, self-sustaining and maintenance-free, stripped of their energy systems by the civilization that inherited them, standing now in the cities of the world in beautiful and silent testimony to a technology that was real and is gone. The global canal network, the waterways that stretched across continents and connected civilizations across the northern hemisphere in an integrated hydraulic system of planetary scale, managing the movement of water with a sophistication that our own water management has never matched. And the seventh, the hardest, the most intimate, the human being who built all of it, who understood consciousness as a field phenomenon, who designed environments to support the full flourishing of human awareness, who is gone in one sense and present in another, carried forward in the persistent knowledge traditions of 100 cultures, in the geometric intuitions of traditional builders, in the healing wisdom of traditions that official medicine dismisses and cannot quite eradicate, in the part of every human nervous system that still resonates with the world it is embedded in, still receives the frequencies of earth and sky, still knows, in a way below words, that it belongs here. The stones are patient. The questions they hold are patient. The mystery is patient. And you are here at the end of a long story, breathing slowly in the warm dark, and the weight of sleep is complete, and the day is done, and the questions can wait until morning. They will be there. They have been there for centuries. They will not go anywhere, but you will go somewhere now. You will go into the deep sleep that restores the body and refreshes the mind and reconnects the self to the larger thing it is part of. The thing that different traditions have called by different names. The ground of being, the field, the source, the void, the all, the everything and the nothing. The thing that is there every night when consciousness releases its grip on its own story and dissolves into rest. The old buildings will stand through the night. The star forts will hold their geometry in the dark. The stones will fit together, as they have always fitted together, in the silent precision that no one can explain. And you will sleep, as humans have always slept, in the dark, on the earth, under the sky, in the field that connects everything. Breathing, warm, still, home. Good night. Sleep well. The mystery is beautiful and patient, and it will be there in the morning. But the morning is a long way away. And tonight, there is only this breath, this warmth, this silence, this rest. Sleep now. The hidden cities beneath the cities. One of the persistent themes in alternative Tartaria research is the existence of underground spaces beneath the old cities of the world. Not sewers, not modern utility tunnels. Chambers and corridors and rooms of dressed-defined stone, clearly constructed, clearly deliberate, clearly belonging to a tradition of building that is not acknowledged in official architectural history. These underground spaces are well documented, not in alternative history publications, but in the mainstream press, in city government records, in the reports of utility workers and construction crews who encounter them when digging foundations for new buildings or installing new water and electrical infrastructure. They appear in Edinburgh, where a network of medieval vaults beneath the Royal Mile has been partially excavated and is now a tourist attraction, though its full extent is unknown and its oldest levels have not been dated. They appear in Paris, where beneath the tourist-accessible catacombs there are levels that are not publicly accessible, chambers that city authorities have sealed, corridors that extend beyond the known map of the tunnels. They appear in Rome, where new construction projects regularly uncover rooms and corridors and spaces of cut stone that predate the Roman construction visible at the surface, that belong to something older than Rome. They appear in the New World, in cities whose official history does not allow for underground construction of this sophistication. In Cincinnati, Ohio, where a network of tunnels and chambers was discovered beneath the city during 19th century construction, attributed vaguely to the pre-Civil War period for no particular reason, never fully mapped or studied. In Louisville, Kentucky, with a similar network. In Chicago, with tunnels that predate the city's own official founding. In cities across the American Midwest that were supposedly frontier settlements 150 years ago, the ground beneath reveals an infrastructure that frontier settlements did not build. Alternative researchers see these underground spaces as the lower levels of the Tartarian civilization, the parts that were buried not by deliberate demolition, but by the mud flood itself, sealed under the sediment of the catastrophic event, and now slowly, one construction project at a time, being rediscovered by a civilization that does not know what it is finding. The pattern they describe is a civilization built in layers. The surface level, the visible level, of the Tartarian buildings was the functional public face. Below the surface, connected by stairs and lifts and passages, now buried under centuries of fill, were additional levels of the same buildings, levels that served functions not visible from the street: storage of materials, generation and distribution of energy, access to water systems, quiet spaces for activities that required isolation from the noise and movement of the surface. These lower levels were sealed when the flood came. The water and mud that buried the first floors of the buildings also buried the entrances to the underground spaces below them. And when the new civilization moved into the buildings and established itself at the new ground level, it did not know, or chose not to remember, that there were levels below the levels it was occupying. Over time, in some cases, the underground spaces were rediscovered. The basements of old buildings, when dug out for new uses, sometimes broke through into chambers that were clearly not part of the building's known construction. The workers who found these chambers reported them in some cases and sealed them in others, and occasionally said, "Nothing at all," which is what you do when you find something you cannot explain and that might complicate the project you are working on. But the chambers are there, below the cities, below the streets, in the dark under the stone that the cities are built on, sealed, patient, full of the silence of a very long wait. This is a thought for the edge of the deepest sleep. The idea that beneath the place where you are lying, beneath the building and the foundation and the bedrock, there are spaces that were once inhabited, that were once warm and lit and purposeful, that the earth has been keeping in the dark, in the cold, waiting. Not a threatening thought, not a frightening one, a mysterious one, a beautiful one, in its way. The earth as a keeper of things, a great slow patient keeper that holds what it is given and releases it only when the right conditions arrive. The right conditions are coming. We are approaching, through our own bumbling progress of scientific understanding and archaeological discovery and the warming of the permafrost and the digging of urban utilities, a moment of recovery. Not all at once, not with sudden revelation, but piece by piece, chamber by chamber, tunnel by tunnel, question by question, the buried layer is being uncovered. And in the meantime, the stone waits, the dark waits. The patience that belongs to things that are very old and very certain of their own existence continues without urgency, without anxiety, without any quality that time can touch. This is what deep sleep is like. Not blank, not empty, but patient and dark and very old. The place where the surface self-dissolves and something more fundamental takes over. The maintenance of the body, the processing of the day, the repair of what has been used, the deepening of what matters. All of it happening in the dark, below the level of conscious awareness, in the part of you that is as patient as stone. Let the surface dissolve. Let the maintenance begin. Let the dark and the depth have you now. This is the final passage, the last words of the night's long story. Past this point, there is only breathing, only the slow rhythm of the sleeping body, only the quiet work of rest. The Tartarian civilization built magnificent things. Whether it existed in the form the researchers describe or not, something extraordinary happened in the human past that left its mark in stone and geometry and the persistent memory of traditions that refuse to die. The questions are real. The anomalies are real. The beauty of the old buildings is real. And you are real. And sleep is real. And the restorative dark of the night is real. These are the things that matter right now. These and nothing else. Breathe. Release. Drift. Down. Further. Gone. A final word on the mystery itself. Before we close entirely, there is one last thing worth sitting with, in the manner of sitting with things that cannot be resolved, that cannot be filed away, that exist as open questions the way a window exists as open sky. The Tartaria theory, in all its complexity and controversy and speculative boldness, is ultimately about something very simple. It is about the gap between what we can observe and what we have been told to believe. The stones that are fitted more precisely than our tools can match. The buildings that were funded by budgets that do not exist in the historical record. The maps that show an empire where official history says there was only wilderness. The underground chambers beneath the cities. The buried first floors. The acoustic chambers. The ether antennas pointing at the sky. None of these observations, taken individually, is conclusive. Each one has an official explanation that may be correct. The polygonal stonework may have been achieved by methods of patient labor that we underestimate. The civic buildings may have been funded by investment schemes whose records were lost. The maps may reflect geographic ignorance rather than geographic knowledge. The underground chambers may be the basements of known buildings rather than the remnants of a buried civilization. Perhaps these are possibilities. They are the responsible, conservative, evidence-respecting possibilities of a scholarly tradition that has earned its conservatism through the careful work of generations of researchers. But there is also the possibility that the alternative researchers are pointing at something real, that the accumulation of anomalies is not a collection of coincidences and misinterpretations, but the outline of a genuine gap in the historical record, that the civilization researchers called Tartaria was real and large and technologically sophisticated in ways that official history cannot currently accommodate, and that the process of its disappearance from that history was not simply the natural forgetting of distant events, but something more deliberate, more systematic, and more recent than we have been told. The truth, if there is a single truth to be found, probably lies in some complex relationship between these possibilities. History is rarely simple. The past is rarely exactly what any theory, official or alternative, claims it to be. Reality has a way of being stranger and more layered than any framework can fully capture. What the Tartaria mystery offers, whatever its ultimate resolution, is practice in a particular kind of intellectual courage. The courage to look at the world and say, I notice that something here does not fit the story I have been given. I'm going to hold that observation. I'm not going to rush to dismiss it, but I'm also not going to rush to the most dramatic explanation available. I'm going to sit with the not knowing, with the open question, with the genuine mystery and see what that sitting teaches me. This is a valuable practice in the daylight hours. It is also, surprisingly, a valuable practice at the edge of sleep. The part of the mind that relaxes into not knowing, that can hold a question without demanding an immediate answer, is also the part that allows sleep to come. The anxious mind that must resolve every uncertainty before it can rest is the mind that lies awake in the dark. The mind that can say, sincerely, "I don't know, and that's all right," is the mind that finds the passage into rest. You don't know whether Tartaria was real. You don't know what the star forts were for, or what the copper spires drew down from the sky, or who cut the stones with impossible precision and why. You don't know what is in the underground chambers beneath the cities, or what the old maps were really showing, or what happened in the 19th century to produce the world we inherited. And that is all right. The not knowing is not a failure. It is not a lack. It is an honest relationship with the genuine complexity of the world, which is always and everywhere more than any story we tell about it. Rest in the not knowing. Rest in the open question. Rest in the beautiful, strange, irreducible mystery of a world that has been here far longer than we have, and that holds its secrets with the patience of stone and the silence of deep water and the darkness of the earth below the earth. It is all here. You are part of it. And you are resting now. Finally, completely. Without reservation. Good night. Sleep well.